the pendulum swing from one opposite to the other, right? With Descartes, you have the preeminent rationalist who wants the most abstract certitude possible and to ground something in the strongest possible incorrigibility, indubitability. And then in response to this, you have people who come along. Again, Hume is, of course, the classic skeptic who says, well, wait a minute. Let's talk about how we actually know things. As far as Hume thinks, knowledge only comes through the five senses. That's it. There's no other reason or basis to believe in knowledge at all beyond just the sense data that's coming in. And so Hume is an attempt to be supremely consistent with the presupposition of the peripatetic axiom.
Yes.
So notice that Hume's starting point is exactly the same as Aristotle's, exactly the same as Aquinas's. But Hume is saying, guys, Aristotle, Aquinas, you guys have not been consistent. You've told me that the peripatetic axiom is that there's nothing in the intellect that's not first in the senses, but then you have violated that by believing in all of these things that you can't show me are actually in sense data. Now, this is where people get tripped up, as you know. They think that we're being Humeans or we're being radical skeptics.
Right.
No, the point is to this is about the issue of justification, ultimately.
Right.
And justifying a belief means giving a good reason for that belief. That's all we're talking about here. I mean, there's more to it. There's justified true belief and then the Gettier problem and all that. But basically speaking, what we're looking for is good reasons for why we believe what we believe. That's what we are looking for when we talk about grounding or justification for a belief. And Hume is just simply saying that it's time to throw out all these metaphysics books, because it may be the case that all the metaphysics are correct, but I want to know how you're epistemically justified in making those claims, those leaps, those beliefs.
Right.
That's the point here.
And on the basis of empiricism, you cannot do that. It's impossible.
Exactly. So if our knowledge is limited to sense data, Hume's saying, I'm going to be consistent with that and call out all of the history of philosophy, which has violated that by importing all of these things that are not actually in sense data. And so the classic example, as you pointed out, is the problem of induction, or causality is also one that's mentioned. And these are just simply to say that induction is that the future will be like the past. It's the process of, for example, science reasoning from the particular to general conclusions.
Right.
And there's an unjustified leap there, because as a finite empirical being, you never have access to this universal state of affairs.
Right.
So you're never justified in going from particular to the universal claim. Right. And so you're always stuck in the particular, and then it's always thus a kind of skepticism. And so this is where Hume gets into his arguments about how, you don't actually have a basis to believe that the sun will rise tomorrow, because you can't just appeal to the fact that it rose in the past.
Exactly. And we'll see that Bertrand Russell, in the article that you were referencing, he makes this appeal. Well, we can just assume based on past experience that the future has been like the past, but this becomes circular in and of itself, and we'll get to this when we get into the 20th century.
Right. So Hume also raises other important questions, like you said, like that we can't justify belief in things like causality, because when you see event A and event B happening, one billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, you're calling that the principle of causation, but there's no actual basis to say that the sense data is actually showing you the principle of causation itself.
Right.
You're just observing event A followed by event B, and you're calling that causation, but that doesn't give you a justification for the universal principle of, quote, causation. And so Hume just kind of does this same move in a lot of different areas, the identity of objects over time, right? I mean, you're saying that I'm the same Jay today as I was when I was a baby, but what's the actual empirical basis to believe that? What's the empirical basis to believe in the past? What's the empirical basis to believe in memory, right? That our memory is accurate or something like that. So you could raise a series of questions that are Humean types of questions that lead us to a difficult boxed in position of radical skepticism, on the basis of saying that if our starting point for our system, if our foundation for our belief system is classical foundationalism or empiricism, we're going to be stuck in these dead end boxes, because we may believe all kinds of things that happen to be true, but the problem is that we don't have good reasons to believe them. So this is where you could say from the time of Aristotle to Aquinas or up to Descartes, it's basically a foundationalist model that's at work in almost everybody.
Yep.
And then from Descartes up on, all of modern philosophy shifts to questions about epistemology. And by the time of the 20th century, epistemology will die.
Yeah.
Now, I don't believe that it's actually dead.
Right.
But on these secular approaches, it is dead. It will critique and destroy itself such that it will have no basis for its own claims. And that's where W.V.O. Quine will come into play, because Quine will basically just point out that epistemology really hasn't done anything or moved or advanced since Hume.
Right.
It's basically been dead since Hume. And, his famous paper basically says that all we're doing now is psychology. We have to really just surrender the discipline of epistemology. So that's the end goal. And that's why we're going to point out eventually, as you said, that argumentation is ultimately in a way circular. And that's why foundationalism is going to be a dead-end enterprise and will not work. And many modern epistemologists concede this, right? It's not just Quine. I mean, the Mannion paper mentions 4 or 5 modern epistemologists,
absolutely
secular academics who essentially admit that
pragmatism gains its move at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and that really is the philosophical enterprise of America itself. And so that's why we're doing this talk, because for so many people who don't know what you're talking about when we're talking about all this foundationalism, is that the history of philosophy gets to the 20th century, and it's, again, as you're saying, it's focused on epistemology this whole time. Then it says, well, looks like we can't make any single epistemological claims without being circular. And really it opens up then traditional metaphysics in regards to theistic interpretation. So when you do your apologetics, you're actually at the forefront of the philosophical conversation going back to Aristotle. It's just people don't understand this when they're talking to you about it.
Right. So, yeah, and I think we should mention too a couple other kind of attempts of rescue that have been had in the history of philosophy for these positions. I mean, if you have the Bonjour text, which is epistemology that Father Deacon Ananias recommends, the Bonjour text. Not familiar. There's some really good sections where he mentions weak foundationalism. So somebody might say, well, maybe this Cartesian approach is not going to work. But what about something else that's maybe not as tall an order or a higher request to have indubitable certitude? Maybe we can have a weak foundationalism which doesn't require indubitable certitude, but enters into probabilities. Mm-hmm. And I mean, we don't have to go too deep into this, but the idea that probabilities can function as justifications for beliefs is not going to work, because, again, we're going to be confronted with arbitrariness. Because if we start to say that, well, we're justified in believing X if it has 90% probability, I mean, it's just kind of silly, actually, if you think about it. 80%, I mean, it's arbitrary. Like, what percentage? Because when you enter into probabilities, you're bringing in numbers, right? And percentages. Like, there's no clear idea as to what percentage of a belief being probably false or correct tells you that it's justified. It's, again, it just becomes an exercise in arbitrariness, which was the original critique that we had of foundationalism. And there's another really important point to add about foundationalism, that the crux of the problem here, and this is not just for this would apply to strong or weak foundationalists, which is that in order to have a starting point of a justified belief, we have to, from the outset, already have a notion of our criteria of justification. But that's the thing that's in question, is what is the criteria of justification? And so there's this just seemingly insurmountable problem that, as Mannion points out, I'll phrase it the way he phrased it because it's really good. He says, we must determine our criteria of justification prior to determining our criteria of justification.
Right.
And that circularity is not going to go away when we try to move into these other schools or these other secular approaches. Even coherence theory will have insights about how our beliefs work as more like a web or a network. But even that will actually be another form of foundationalism. I'm talking about secular coherence theory, right? Now, that's another mistake a lot of people make is they hear somebody say that our beliefs have to be coherent or that we have insights from coherence theory. They'll say, "Oh, well, then you're a secular coherence theorist," and no, there's just as many problems with that as there is with foundationalism.
Right.